The freemen of America did not wait until usurped power had strengthened itself by exercise and entangled the question in precedents. They saw all the consequences in the principle, and they avoided the consequences by denying the principle. You see, the legislative branch, also known as Congress, was given much greater powers than even the executive and judicial branches combined. Article 1 of the Constitution describes powers of the legislature, including the making of laws and raising money through creating and collecting taxes, paying federal debts, providing for a united military, borrowing money, regulating commerce and immigration, declaring war, and overseeing the location of the federal government. It seems nearly endless, right? But despite those powers, the founders felt it was necessary to put rules and regulations on the legislature to keep from oppressing the states, the individuals, and their God-given rights. Today we often hear about the power of the president, also known as the executive branch. It is a common misconception that the president is supposed to make laws. That is the responsibility of Congress. But as you'll learn, the Founding Fathers never intended one person to solve the nation's problems. Another misconception is that the Supreme Court, otherwise known as the judicial branch, also makes laws. However, their primary responsibility is to determine the validity of laws based on the Constitution and determine cases brought before them based on that determination. The founders intentionally decided to divide and distribute the duties and power among the three branches of government, giving the main primary authority to Congress as they are elected by the people. It was John Adams, our second president, and father of our sixth president, John Quincy Adams, who said, "It is weakness rather than wickedness which renders men unfit to be trusted with unlimited power." To spread out the power even more, the legislative branch was divided into two houses. The first was the House of Representatives, made up of officials elected by the people to represent the population within each state. Since the House has the greatest responsibility under the Constitution, their terms are short to help check corruption. That is why they are elected to 2 years in office. The Senate, the second body, on the other hand, are elected by state legislatures, each to 6-year terms. Their duties are to represent each state and their governments. This was designed so state governments would have a powerful role in checks and balances to the federal government, so that it would not gain total power over the people. The Founding Fathers never intended the federal government to rule over the states or the people, but instead to work together with the states on nearly all matters. In 1913, the arrangement of the Senate changed entirely with the adoption of the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. That removed state governments from the federal lawmaking process almost entirely, essentially weakening the checks and balances of state power and state government impact on federal actions. In the Federalist Papers, a set of documents still used to properly interpret the Constitution today, James Madison warned, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary." To inform the minds of the people and to follow their will is the chief duty of those placed at their head. The original intent of the founders was for the executive branch to be the enforcer of laws created by the legislature and compared to the Constitution by the Supreme Court. Article 2 of the Constitution lists the duties of the executive branch. It starts by describing the terms, qualifications, and method of selection for an American president. A presidential term is 4 years, and every president is limited to 2 terms. In order to run for president or vice president, the candidate must be a natural-born U.S. citizen, at least 35 years old, and a resident of the United States for at least 14 years. Candidates are then voted on and elected by the citizens and Electoral College. The Electoral College ensures the less populated states have an equal voice in presidential elections. Article 2 of the Constitution describes the removal, replacement, selection, and duties of the Vice President. If the President is impeached, the Vice President assumes the presidency, and the Speaker of the House becomes Vice President. Sections 2 and 3 of Article 2 define the duties and responsibilities of the executive branch, which include Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, if we are at war, as declared by Congress. To continue that point, our first president, George Washington, said, "The Constitution vests the power of declaring war in Congress. Therefore, no offensive expedition of importance can be undertaken until after they shall have deliberated upon the subject and authorized such a measure." In other words, the President is not Commander-in-Chief until Congress declares war. I'd like to bring in our friend Dr. Smith, who's considered an expert in constitutional law and American politics. Dr. Smith, can you tell us what the original role of Commander-in-Chief entailed?
The role of Commander-in-Chief, as envisioned by the founders, was to give the President the power to act quickly when necessary during times of national crisis. Primarily, they have in mind here civil war, insurrection, or an invasion, where the Commander-in-Chief has the power to step up, mobilize resources, and defend America against an onslaught. It's limited, of course, by the power of Congress to declare war, and so those two powers balance together. In other words, the Commander-in-Chief power really gives the President the ability to use his resources as necessary to defend us. However, he can't commit all of government's resources to that fight without a declaration of war or without the support of Congress.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Other duties of the President include granting pardons to convicted criminals, reporting to Congress on the condition of the country, and the main duty, to see that laws are faithfully executed. Over time, the President's powers have expanded beyond what the Constitution stated. Since 1945, the President has assumed the power to declare war and manage war without the approval of Congress. The founders intended the President to be a public servant with the duties of enforcing just and constitutional laws. They never intended the executive branch to rule over individuals or states. In 1798, our third president and author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, warned us, "It is jealousy and not confidence which prescribes limited constitutions to bind down those whom we are obliged to trust with power. Our Constitution has accordingly fixed the limits to which, and no further, our confidence may go." Let's bring back Dr. Smith. Doctor, can you explain to us when executive orders are constitutional?
It's a good question. It's a difficult question, actually. Executive orders, I think, are constitutional so long as they don't have the weight of law, in the sense that they usurp either congressional power or that they contradict parts of the Constitution. And in some ways, an executive order does function like a little piece of legislation, but it can't do the same things that legislation can. Executive orders might be able to dictate how particular funds are spent that the executive branch has already been given power to spend. But there are limits on those executive orders. If they're clearly unconstitutional, then the Supreme Court can step in and rule them as unconstitutional, and they will be null and void as a result. If Congress wants to circumvent an executive order, all they have to do is pass a law, and that executive order becomes null and void.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. The first and governing maxim in the interpretation of a statute is to discover the meaning of those who made it. The founders designed the judicial branch with just a short list of very specific duties and responsibilities: to review cases and laws in light of the Constitution, to judge cases not solved by lower courts, to judge cases not in a state's jurisdiction, to judge cases involving non-U.S. citizens, to ensure that all courts operate under guidelines of the U.S. Constitution. Of all the three branches of government, the judicial branch has the least amount of political power. In fact, the entire creation of the Supreme Court takes up less than 375 words in the Constitution itself. When the Constitution was written, there were two radical differences which separated our judicial branch from the judicial branches of all other countries of the time. The first is a trial by a jury of peers. In other words, a judge cannot determine if the person being tried is guilty or innocent. That responsibility is voted on by the jury. The second is that in many countries, judges are able to make laws. However, the Constitution clearly states that lawmaking is the responsibility of Congress and not the courts. To emphasize this point, we'd like to bring in our friend Dr. Smith, who is considered an expert in American politics and constitutional law. Dr. Smith, is judicial lawmaking constitutional?
Judicial lawmaking means that the court is engaging in a process that's more properly reserved to Congress. Almost by definition, that's unconstitutional. However, the problem is that the Supreme Court in our system ultimately determines what is or is not constitutional. And so even though it might appear to be unconstitutional on its face, the Supreme Court, through its own decisions, kind of defines the limits of its own power, which is really what makes the Supreme Court so enormously powerful when it chooses to be powerful. We should always keep in mind, though, that if the court gets out of bounds, if the court does things that the legislature, that Congress in this case particularly does not want to have done, they always have the power to do something about it. Congress can impeach and remove justices from the court. Congress can limit the court's appellate jurisdiction. Congress could do all sorts of things to trim the court's power if Congress chooses to do so.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. The Constitution gives the court the power to review the actions of the President and the Congress to determine whether they fit well with the guidelines of the United States Constitution. In other words, the Supreme Court is designed to make sure all government officials are playing fair. The only types of cases the courts do not oversee are impeachment cases of government officials. Those cases are seen by Congress. That is why it's so important to identify the power of the courts. Alexander Hamilton, one of our founding fathers and author of the Federalist Papers, said, "It can be of no weight to say that the courts, on the pretense of a repugnancy, may substitute their own pleasure to the constitutional intentions of the legislature." In other words, what Hamilton was saying was that the Constitution is the final law, not the opinion of the courts. The founders designed the entire government to work within the protective confines of the Constitution. Let's bring back Dr. Smith. Dr. Smith, how does Congress limit judicial jurisdiction?
There are a couple of ways that are very practical and a couple of them very impractical. Practically, Congress can always rewrite a law that the Supreme Court has interpreted in a way that Congress does not like. And so if the Supreme Court hands down a ruling in interpreting a congressional act and Congress finds that interpretation either unflattering or maybe even offensive to a majority of Congress, then Congress can simply rewrite the law. They can take care of that language if they choose to do so. Congress can also, just by simple majority, limit the court's appellate jurisdiction. What that means, most cases get to the United States Supreme Court by being appealed from lower courts, either state Supreme Courts or from lower federal courts. Congress can actually define what kinds of cases can go to the Supreme Court and what kinds of cases cannot through that appellate jurisdiction. And so let's say, for instance, that the Supreme Court is making a whole bunch of rulings on the issue of gay marriage. Let's say that eventually happens. And Congress does not like those rulings. Congress could then say, well, all issues of marriage shall stop at the Circuit Court of Appeals level, and the Supreme Court will not hear those particular cases. So those are very practical ways that Congress can act to limit the court's functions. In some ways, impractically, Congress can also impeach and remove members of the Supreme Court if they choose to do that. But as you can tell, historically, that's very difficult to do, and it's very unusual for the Congress to even talk about impeaching a member of the Supreme Court. They can also pass a constitutional amendment. We've seen that happen a couple of times where the court has made a ruling that Congress did not like, and so then Congress goes through the process of passing an amendment to the Constitution, which essentially makes the court's ruling null and void.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Following the adoption of the Constitution in 1789, George Washington appointed the first Supreme Court judge, James Wilson. Today, the court consists of our Chief Justice and 8 Associate Justices. Supreme Court justices serve a life term on the bench, and more than 100 people have sat on the Supreme Court since its creation. Each year, around 10,000 requests for rulings reach the Supreme Court, but less than 150 are actually considered. Hopefully, you learned a little bit more about your United States Constitution. I'm Alan Scholl for the Freedom Project. Welcome home.